Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Katie McDonald. I am a community engaged researcher who is working with Civi. Today, I'm going to be doing a short little video for you on some skills development around problem solving strategies with specific intention to increase individual resiliency. So let's get started. So when you're thinking about problem solving, it's important to recognize that there are different forms of problem solving. So the sort of three stereotypical ideas of problem solving that we have are analytical, creative, and practical. So the analytical is kind of the archetype that we think of when we think of good problem solving. So it's sort of this logical, rational, reasonable approach to problem solving that uses abstract thinking to solve familiar problems to us. The second is creative, where unusual solutions are thought of or created in new and unfamiliar circumstances. And finally, practical problem solving, which is really situational. It's very much specific to the context in which it is in, and can use logic and creative problem solving as well as kind of this real life problem solving skill set. Okay, so let's dive into each of them a little bit more. So analytical problem solving is, as I mentioned, this kind of logical approach to problem solving. It's a form of problem solving that we're very familiar with because it's kind of the stereotypical one that we see often depicted around problem solving as the kind of good, quote unquote, approach to problem solving. It involves asking lots of questions at each level, and involves a really deep look at what the problem is. So once a problem or difficulty emerges in analytical problem solving, the very first step is to understand the problem on a really deep level. So to really understand fulsomely what is the problem, what it looks like, and what needs to be done. So people do this by asking many questions to make sure you have a firm grasp of the problem and everything that's involved. So this can include asking, what is the problem? What do we know about it? What is the seriousness? Is there a specific timeline we have on solving it? What will happen if it's not solved? Is there other information I need? Who is impacted by this and who needs to act? So lots of questions to really get a full picture. The second step is then to understand the outcomes that you are after. And this is really important because there are lots of ways to solve problems that end up with different outcomes. So it's important to really articulate from the outset, especially if it's a team approaching a problem, what are the outcomes that we want? So you would ask questions like, what do we want? What outcome would satisfy us? What will we define as a success? Who should be involved in determining if this is a success for who? So, for example, some of the problems that we often encounter in the affordable housing field are things like turnover, good maintenance, having growth to a business, increasing internal efficiency, probably really recently continuing to provide service while COVID is happening and changing restrictions wherever you are, addressing a waitlist issue, whether that is a long wait list or trying to match people with the right unit. And so the solutions to some of those problems might be really different depending on what outcome you want. So the third step is to come up with 2 or more solutions to the problem that will get you to your desired outcome. In this step, after you've brainstormed a few possible solutions, it's important to consider potential risks or unintended consequences of each solution. This is also a good time to bring other people into the problem. So you might involve a mentor, you might involve the person you report to, or you might even involve other teams that could be impacted. In some cases, you might involve a tenant committee, for example. So as an example, within the pandemic, if you're moving to online, it's important to think about unintended impacts. So if applications are submitted online, does that impact other teams? How do they access the information? How do tenants access it? What does that mean for organizations that are assisting tenants, right? So really thinking about that bigger picture. So the fourth step then, once you have those solutions outlined and you've thought about the risks and the consequences, is to select the best option and then do it, right? So to say, okay, given what the problem is and the outcomes that we want, this is our best solution and let's implement it. Then the next 4 steps are kind of iterative. They're ongoing. You can kind of ping pong between them. So you want to analyze the outcome by asking for feedback. And again, you might be asking for feedback from multiple parties who are impacted, right? Because it might be at this point that you realize, oh, we didn't realize these stakeholders were impacted by the solution. Once you have that feedback, you can say, okay, what is working, what isn't working? Do we need to change anything? Step 7 is to modify if you need to. And then step 8 is to reevaluate the outcome, right? So maybe you reevaluate the outcome and then you ping pong back to 4, right? You might select a new solution, or you might modify the solution from before and then evaluate again. So the idea of this kind of logic model of problem solving is that there's always an attention to detail and feedback and really understanding along the development of the solution, who is involved, who is impacted, how can we improve? Okay. The second approach to problem solving is creative problem solving. And this is a very different approach. And it's often for unusual solutions in newer, unfamiliar circumstances. So as we go through this might resonate for many of you in how you responded to some of the challenges of the pandemic, because it's unfamiliar to many of us. And this kind of problem solving has to begin with kind of like an optimistic belief and commitment that there's a possible solution, right? So it has to be embedded in this willingness to agree that there will be a solution. So the first step is to flood your mind with information. You just want to gather as much information as you can. This means reading everything, researching the problem, maybe an environmental scan, talking to stakeholders, really trying to understand the complexity of the problem and saturating brain with all of that information. Step 2 is to think outside the box. So here you want to be really thinking about what are some outrageous ideas, what's something creative, what's something we can do that would be unheard of, right? So in this stage, you want to embody kind of this curious, childlike wonder, like, what if we did this? Could we do this? What about this? And it's really important in this stage, whether you're working alone or with a team, to not have a voice saying, that's stupid, we can't do that, here's why it won't work. This situation of the creative problem solving process is really about generating ideas. It's very generative. And there might be ideas that you would never implement, there might be wild ideas, but they belong in this part of the process. And these kinds of voices of saying this won't work, we can't do this, limit creativity and kind of move us towards not this kind of generative thinking, right? It shuts it down. Then you want to ask yourself lots of questions to explore the information that you put in your brain, right? So you have all this information from step 1. So you want to say things like, how can I look at this differently? What's the opposite of what we're doing right now? What is the opposite of some of these solutions? What is an outrageous solution? What is something, this, you might think of someone you admire in the field and you would say, okay, what would this person do? You might think of someone you admire in a totally different field and say, what would they say about this problem? How would their perspective shift things? And then finally, you would start listing as many solutions as possible. And again, this step is just this big generative process of listing solutions. And then the final step in the creative problem solving process is to take a break. So this is why sometimes when you're, going for a walk or you're laying down to go to bed or you're taking a shower, you get a really good idea. And that's because while you're not consciously thinking about the problem, subconsciously your brain is processing all of that information you've given it. And so when you allow your brain the time to do that, it's able to kind of come up with a solution to amalgamate or merge some of that information and to come up with something really interesting. So this part of the process is really hard to do because when we're faced with problems, we want to get to them quickly, but it's really, really important in creative problem solving. Okay, so this is the Remote Associates Test, which is a test of creative thinking potential. It's developed by Martha Mednick in 1962 and is considered a valid measure of creativity. So there's a each question will have 3 words, and the challenge is to think of the 4th word that links those 3 words, okay? So I'm gonna give you 3 examples, and I'm not gonna give the answers, so I'll give you time to go through them. And then if you're on a team, pause the video and discuss. And if you are on your own, then think to yourself. Okay, so the first set of 3 words are cottage, Swiss, and cake. The second list of 3 words, flower, friend, and scout. And then the third is home, sea, and bed. So I'm gonna invite you to pause the video now, and I want you to think of 3 words, 1 for each line, that connects those 3 words. So what connects cottage, Swiss, and cake? What connects flower, friend, and scout? What connects home, sea, and bed? Okay, so I'll let you pause. I will assume you paused and now you're back. So the 3 words that connect these are cheese, girl, and sick. So cottage cheese, Swiss cheese, cheesecake, flower girl, girlfriend, Girl Scout, and homesick, seasick, bedsick. Okay, so these get progressively harder. And if you're interested in doing more, you can follow the link here or in the toolkit that this video is in. It will be included in the resources as well. Okay, so the last and final approach to problem solving is practical problem solving. Now, practical problem solving is used to solve situational real life problems. It's a kind of problem solving that's unique because it could be used in analytical and creative problem solving at the same time. So it brings them together. Okay, so it's a unique way of solving problems. It's about looking for a practical and clever solution. And it's often with a really immediate need, okay? So it may be that there's a problem that has an immediate need, but also maybe a longer term problem that will remain, right? So you might need to later come back to analytical creative problem solving. So there are no steps here because it's really always situational, right? There's no guide to doing this because it's about the unique situation that you are in. These tend to be MacGyver type solutions, something simple using existing resources. If you work in the housing sector, I'm sure you've done this a million times because there are often emergent problems and we can only use our existing resources. So an example apparently is that if your radiator starts to leak, you can use egg whites to patch up the radiator until you get to a repair shop. And one that you might be more familiar with in housing is if a tenant calls and says that their balcony lock is broken and you can get someone there in the afternoon, but it's the morning and they're feeling unsafe, then you could suggest to them to find, a hockey stick or a dowel or something of a similar shape to put in the track of the door so that it couldn't get open. So it's a MacGyver fix in the moment to something that might need a bigger solution later. Finally, it's really important to recognize that people and teams that are resilient rely on the expertise and diversity within their team. So resilient people approach problem solving with a sense of humility. So a recognition of the gifts that we bring, as well as the gifts that others are bringing. And to see that this multiplicity of perspectives and views will necessarily make our solutions stronger and more robust. Resilient people know that if they bring a solution to their team, that together they'll come up with something together that's even stronger. Thank you so much for joining this little session on problem solving. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you learned something. I hope that there's something you can apply in your work. And I hope you tune into our other videos. Thank you so much.